Cool. Does it work? Yes. All right. Yeah, I want to talk about a little bit about HTML and ERB parsing. This is mostly from, well, yeah. My name is Marco. If you haven't met, I have been doing a lot of open source recently. Most of the notable ones are Stimulus that's been maintaining the last few years, but also libraries like Stimulus Reflex and Cable Ready. And kind of all of these ecosystems and tools have inspired me to create more tools to this ecosystem. So there's a lot of Turbo libraries, a lot of Stimulus libraries, and that's also what brings us here today, which is to talk about HTML ERB tooling. But before we get into that, I want to give a short kind of history, a brief history about tooling that we had in the past. And for Ruby, the editor tooling hasn't been the best. It's mostly hasn't been having a lot of tools at all, or just very basic support in the past. And it kind of changed with RubyMine in 2008 when it came out. It had a lot of more tools, a lot of more smart Ruby-specific tooling that kind of helped with that. Then for the longest time, we had this situation where you had to build all the integrations for all the different languages for each editor, which means if you want to use VS Code, you have to have a Ruby plugin. If you want to use something else, you also have to write a Ruby plugin for that. That's been the case for the most of the time these existed, which is why it kind of changed with the language server protocol in like almost 10 years ago. So now what we can do is, similar to the MCP that Ricardo was talking about, you have like one interface that you have to write the tools once, the logic once, and then you can kind of use all the different editors that support it, and then you have the tooling for all of them. In Ruby, we had Solograph fairly early on, but it's been quite tricky to get this running if you have tried it in the past. It's not been super reliable, it hasn't been working great, even though they have been kind of setting the path forward of what it could be in the Ruby world too. So since then we got a lot of other tools, and we kind of saw that LSPs are the way forward, like the TypeScript LSP, the Tailwind LSP. There's a lot of LSPs out there that have really been awesome to use, and I guess that's what inspired a lot of us to build these tools in Ruby too. So a few years ago we got the Ruby LSP from Shopify, which really helped with making it more accessible to people and makes it really nice to use in your day-to-day coding. But from working on a lot of JavaScript stuff, I noticed that the developer experience they have is really awesome. So it's really nice to use these tools, which is why I created a Stimulus LSP a few years ago that helps with autocomplete, with validations of the attributes, with diagnostics. So it supports a bunch of features which are all on the HTML part, but also on the JavaScript part when you are writing Stimulus controllers to just help you write better controls in general. And then later I also published a very basic Turbo LSP, which doesn't do much. It also helps with autocomplete, but that's kind of the problem that I was facing. But something was clear that the LSPs are really the path forward, which is why I wanted to invest more. But that's kind of where I noticed that something is missing for the tooling, which was that most of these tools were HTML only, which means that if you have a blob of HTML, in Stimulus now we kind of care about these attributes, the data attributes, but it's only worked so far with just HTML. So there was no ERB support, there was no support for action view hack helpers or anything like that. And for Rails apps, it's quite common to use these helpers. So if you would kind of see this blob somewhere in a code base, it wouldn't have any validation or autocomplete support whatsoever. But you also want to have the errors, the diagnostics, and all of that, no matter if you write HTML or ERB or action view, it should just work. So for that, we need to understand ERB, which is why I was working on this problem. But we never really had anything specific for parsing these files. And now that we have the whole Hotwire, I guess, movement, it's more important than ever. With Rails 7, we got the default built into Rails, so whenever you create a new Rails app, it adds Turbo and Stimulus by default. And from the Rails survey a few years ago, or was it last year, we also saw that Stimulus kind of rose up to the top for the JavaScript frameworks used in Rails. And similarly, the state of tools of JavaScript, which also did a survey, they had this similar result for HTMX, for the library HTMX. this is Alpine.js. It's kind of small in the grand scheme of the JavaScript frameworks, but still it's kind of rising up, and now it's at 8%. And here's where you can see HTMX kind of getting traction too. So we kind of see this trend of going back to the like HTML server-side rendered applications, and that's why I think it's important to have more of these server-side HTML tooling. So yeah, the advanced tooling for these templated languages is getting more important. That was the goal here, to add ERB support too. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to present at Rails World, which I showed off this library here, this slide here. And we had this slide up there for plans to support the ERB support in Turbo whenever the Ruby LSP itself gets ERB support. And that same year, we kind of got together at RubyConf in the US on the hack day, and just wanted to kind of hack on it and see if we can get it working in Ruby LSP. So we got together, kind of worked on this with a few guys from the Ruby LSP team. But I quickly realized that we need something more than just like basic support. In order to be able to build this advanced feature, we need better tooling or better parsing for these files. And as you might know, ERB is versatile, so it doesn't just have to be HTML. For the most stuff, you can also just use it to render text, or in this case, emails, where you just kind of add these ERB snippets and it will kind of just add or render these text files. And for that, we have a bunch of tools and a bunch of parsers that work really well. Even the built-in modern ERB is good enough for that. But what we care about in this case is HTML plus ERB. So we care as well about the HTML. And if you have been following Ruby the past few years, you might seen like Prism, the new Ruby parser that's been coming here and there. So why could we just use Nokogiri for the HTML and Prism for Ruby? And the kind of reality is that if you would do that, we have a snippet with HTML and ERB. What we could do is kind of split it up in two, and then say on the left side, we remove the HTML, and on the right side, we remove the Ruby. So you're just left with pure Ruby code and pure HTML code. And now you could say, okay, let's use Prism to parse the Ruby code, and let's use HTML to parse the HTML. And then you would get some ASTs, some abstract syntax trees back, and you could see, okay, we have these variables and these calls and whatever, and this would work. But the problem is that we lost the HTML context here. So we don't really know, okay, we have this Ruby snippet here, but we don't know where this is being used in the HTML template. So we could kind of piece that together. We could parse that, try to see if we can do something with the location information, kind of try to piece it together. But then it's still a lot of edge cases there. So we wouldn't have to, or we wouldn't really, so we really have to do a bunch of work to make it happen. And at this point, it's probably too complex, that system, to kind of piece this together. And yeah, here's some more examples of where it matters, where you're interpolating. Like if you're interpolating in a HTML element, you want to interpolate attributes, you may want to make sure that there's no on-click that's kind of there, that just is being injected there. Or if you just are in a value of the attributes, it's not as critical. But that's kind of what you want to know, where you are at, to know what this Ruby thing is doing. So I kind of knew I won't sort of have to build this my own parser to make this work. And this is where this idea came about for this HTML-aware ERB parser. So I did some experiments, and I also had to sort of settle on a language. And the problem was that I was using mostly JavaScript or TypeScript for these language servers, because that's what Visual Studio Code uses, what the most tools are written in. But I want to use Ruby. I want to be able to also use it from Ruby. So if I write it in TypeScript, I can't really use it from Ruby. So I could say, okay, let's just write in TypeScript, but then we can't really use it from Ruby. So it's like, we have to find the best way to kind of use it from both. Which is why I decided to write it in C. At first it's a dumb idea. I agree with that, but then again, I didn't know any C before this, but it kind of was a fun project to hack on and kind of work on. And having used it a little bit more now, I feel like it's not as bad as you think. For writing these kinds of tools, C is actually quite good. And that's kind of where we are today. So we have this new tool called ERB. It's a HTML-aware ERB parser, and that's what you want to talk about today. So what is it? So herb is kind of this idea. Herb, the name stands for HTML plus ERB. That's kind of a joke there. But the herb is kind of should be a tool suite where you have a parser, where you have a formatter and a linter for all kinds of ERB templates and files. So first, let's look at the parser. So this is a handwritten parser. It's this HTML-aware ERB parser, and it's written in C99, and also with no dependencies, which makes it super easy to compile and cross-compile to WebAssembly, we'll talk about later a little bit more, but it makes it super easy and lightweight. It uses Prism, the Ruby library, Ruby parser, which is also written in C99, doesn't use any dependency at all, so you can just use that on top of it. So it's using Prism for the Ruby, for parsing the Ruby pieces, and it's also trying to follow its design goals with being portable, error tolerant, and maintainable. So we need a custom lexicon, a custom parser for the HTML. And the idea here is also that it's trying to be built for tooling in mind, not for browsers. Browsers have a different way of parsing HTML. It has some fault tolerance built in. It auto-completes some of the tags. And that's what we don't want for tooling. We want just the exact representation of what's in your file in the syntax tree represented. So when you parse a file, it exposes this interleaved HTML ERB tree, so you can kind of know what's in it. And kind of just as a high-level overview, it's mostly C. There's some Ruby for the Ruby bindings. There are some TypeScript and JavaScript for the JavaScript bindings. And C++ is for Node.js, or native Node.js bindings. So you can kind of use this library written in C in all the tools that you want to use, and that's kind of nice. So in Ruby, you can just add the herb gem to your project, and then it exposes these high-level APIs to do something with the files. You shouldn't be using this in your project directly unless you are really building tools for Ruby, but that's something else. Then we published 2 packages for NPM, one for the Node, one for the browser, so you can actually use this in the browser too. The browser one is using WebAssembly, so the browser runs fully in the browser, just using a WebAssembly, which is kind of cool. It also exposes this API similar to the Ruby one, just like they adapted with the kernel case. So let's look at it, how it works. So when you pass it the empty document, that's the most basic example. You just get a document node and there's nothing in it. So that's super easy. But then if you add some text contents, just like this, you can see we have an HTML text node with the content in here. You can also see we have location information exact here. And that's one of the other things that we couldn't do with Nokogiri. It doesn't actually know about any of the information about the position in the document. What you get is kind of the opening parentheses for the HTML tag, but that's it. Anything else beyond that is not being tracked. So that's one important piece. But what's also nice here is that when you have partial HTML elements, you kind of think of this when you are writing your documents. You never have a complete document when you are in the middle of writing. So it's kind of important to also support that workflow where you have an opening H1 tag, for example, here. And you can see there's some text there and no closing tag. And you can see at the bottom here, there's closing tag is kind of nil. But you still get a HTML nodes and some errors here, and there's a missing tag. But at least you know exactly what's represented in the document. With Nokogiri, this kind of snippet would actually also automatically insert a closing tag. So you would never see this in the tool that there's something missing. Oh yeah, that's it. And then, yeah, that's one here. So if you kind of take this, give it to Nokogiri, parse it, and turn it back to HTML, it will give you this whole thing. So if you want to build some tools to say you have a missing closing tag, Nokogiri doesn't even tell this to you. It just fixes it for you. This is not to blame on Nokogiri. This is how the HTML5 spec works. So this is kind of built into the standard, which is also why this herb parser is not HTML compliant, but that's what we want. So if you give it a complete element, obviously you get the open tag, the body, the close tag, that's easy. And then obviously you can nest them, and you can see the nesting here is there's a body in here, and then inside of that you have the I element here, and then inside here the title. So you have the whole hierarchy of documents. That's just HTML for now, but now let's look at when you add ERB to it. So if you just have a simple variable, You can see there's an ERB content nodes. It has to open the tags kind of separated, and then the content of the Ruby right in here. You can also see it's parsing it, and it's valid Ruby, so it kind of annotates that as well. But then if you look at more kind of advanced structures, if you have two tags kind of belong together, which is common for the if statements or for loops and blocks, you want to know that these kind of belong together. And if you have something inside of it, you want to have this hierarchy too. So here we see we have the ERB content node, which is one. There's the text nodes, that's just the in between, and then the content node below. So, but you can see now it's still separate on the same level. So what you have to do is kind of go through with Prism, parse these individual pieces, and then do some analysis. So you can kind of take this and turn this into more that looks like this. So we have one node as a child, the document, which is the ERB if node. And inside of the statements, we have this two new lines now. And we also can see the end node for the closing tag. But this gives us the hierarchy that we need. And if you now put the HTML element inside of it, you can see that we have the opening one, we have the closing one, and then that's kind of forms the two whole, like the blocks around the contents. And then inside of it, we have this single HTML element that shows the hierarchy here. And this gives us a lot of kind of flexibility to build tools on top of that. So now that we have this kind of opens a lot of the possibilities to do something more with this that we were able to do previously. It obviously also supports attributes, it supports stock types, comments, all the stuff you might know from HTML. And on the Ruby side, we support kind of all of these control structures. All of these have different nodes in ERB2. So you can kind of just target specific things if you want to kind of analyze a Ruby document. So we have now a public release that's out. It's on GitHub on /myprofile/herb. And now we can kind of start to build the fun tools on top of it. This is just the foundation layer. So if you can think of some ideas of what you can do with this, please give it a shot or reach out and we can see what we can do. The other nice thing is that we have now a playground that's interactive in the browser, and that's thanks to the WebAssembly one, so builds. So what we can do is you have a playground, we can add some HTML ERB documents, and this is all being kind of parsed in the browser and kind of shown in the browser, which is super nice because once you have this loaded, it just works offline. And you can see, you can inspect the one, you can kind of highlight, hover over some of these nodes, and it shows you on the left side where it is. Or you can click on the right side and it shows you where in the AST that corresponding node is. So this is on /playground on the website. Cool, then let's look ahead. So we have the parser now, that's the foundation. But now we also want to talk about the formatter and linter. So first the formatter. So the idea here is that you want to build a HTML ERB formatter. If you might be using JavaScript, you might know something like Prettier. So when you have this file, just save it and then it will do its magic. So the idea is we can just give it some malformed HTML document in ERB. You kind of save your file or run the corresponding CLI tool for it. And you will get a well-formed document that's kind of corresponding to all the rules you configured and all of that good stuff. This I've been working on for the past few weeks. I have a somewhat working version now that's actually from yesterday. It's not quite there, it's from the same formatting. As you can see here, so there's still some spacing issues, there's still some line breaks that shouldn't be there, but that's kind of the part now to kind of find the right balance to automatically format these documents. And then the linter, the idea here is also to provide a linter where you can just give it a file, it will tell you all the errors that are there. For example, we could check for actually about HTML5. Even though the process itself is in compliance, we can still add rules on top of it to make sure that actually would be valid HTML5. Or we could add some checks for, do we have all the attributes and all images? This wouldn't even work if you have an image tag in Rails using the active view helper. It would kind of still detect that and see this as an HTML tag, so that's the good thing here. You could check for unsafe interpolation if you are doing some nasty stuff or somebody tries to do some nasty stuff. You could kind of catch this, or a lot of more things. Also the ID is only being used once, and so on. One other kind of aspect I kind of noticed while I was working on this, that we could build a new engine now too. Now that we have deep understanding of the whole document, we can also write an engine for it. This is also what I'm going to talk about at RailsConf in a few weeks. It's this idea of, it's just ideas, it's not a vision, that's what it says in the title. What we could kind of build with this tool now to build a more advanced ERB engine that knows about the HTML2. This is now all called like reaction view, which is the kind of pun again on action view, and to make it reactive. But kind of give you like a sneak peek here. The idea here is that we have a view file. We have some ERB inside of it. We keep track of all the variables, so you have a state somewhere. We kind of render it once, so we get this result down there. And then if kind of this state changes, there's something new that's coming, we detect that. Not sure how we do that, but that's the idea. That the state changes, and then we kind of try to re-render the view. But now, because we only changed the items variable, we don't have to render the whole view again. So we kind of can see this changed, this items variable changed. So we can kind of trace where in the view file that variable is being used. And now you also see that we only have added this 4 to the array. So we only have to kind of render this block here one more time. So we can render the delta for the 4 item now, which will give us this 4 li just on its own. And then if you have some corresponding logic on the client, you can just kind of insert that into the existing view, which also allows us to only kind of send the updates down the wire, which are only kind of changed in between renders. This is kind of similar to live view in the Phoenix world, if you have seen that before. That's kind of also the motivation here. And which here is going a little bit deeper again. This is now for HTML ERB, but nothing that we kind of show here is specific to HTML ERB. We could also do this for Haml or Slim or any other kind of templating language. So the idea here is that we might be able to also say, let's do a templating syntax tree, so we can kind of improve the tooling for any kind of templating language. And right, so here we have this for ERB, so you have your interpolation, you get them over here. But here we just kind of say this is dynamic content. We don't care what it is, but we know it's dynamic content. And for the HTML tags, they can of course correspond to actual HTML tags, so we can kind of keep them as HTML. But if we have, like for example, action view, we don't use HTML tags here. We use the tag helpers, or we use content tag or some other helpers. But if you kind of can trace this and kind of analyze this and say tag.p is actually again still just a p tag, so there's a p HTML element. We can still use the same tree that you get as a result, and then we can just run the whole diagnostics on that tree, which allows us to kind of map for all different languages. And then we can do the same for Haml and say if we see this kind of syntax, we also could just expect a p element from that, and then it doesn't matter what kind of content you write. So you just need some adapter for turning the left side into this shared syntax tree. And obviously you can do the same for Slim or anything else that you can think of. So as long as we can transform this statically somehow, we can kind of combine the logic and the tooling here. Right, and combine our efforts here, yeah. So what's next? This is all super like low level, like not actually usable, which is also why we kind of want to expose this more in your day-to-day code with a VS Code extension. I haven't published it yet. I was meant to need to do this like yesterday, but I have a working version now locally that I want to publish tomorrow probably. And as you can see, you kind of write this, you get the same diagnostics here for missing tags. You can see open tags and don't close them, you get the same diagnostics. If you have syntax errors, you also see that. Obviously the same for Ruby code. And since we're using Prism, it also can understand the Ruby in it. So here you actually get this nice error saying you are missing an end here. which is kind of nice if you have been using ERB before. You're not used to this kind of feedback from your editor. Also, if you kind of use an if on its own without anything else, you kind of see these rich errors here, which is super awesome. And the good thing is, it's written in C, so it's actually super fast. So it's pretty much instant as you type it. It's really nice. Then the format and linter, they aren't ready yet, but that's the plan to kind of establish that to make this work for as many code bases as possible. And ideally, we can kind of integrate this back where it actually all started for me, bring it back to Stimulus LSP, bring it back to the Turbo LSP, and maybe, ideally, integrate this into Ruby LSP, so when you install Ruby LSP, it's all there, no configuration, it just works. And then we can also add some more advanced tools, some more advanced diagnostics, some code actions, some refactoring tools, and that's the idea. I also mentioned this, kind of the action view helpers. So here's kind of a list of these different things you might know from Rails app specifically, that we kind of support all of those, bring them back into the AST. So to the parser, to tooling, it doesn't matter. It doesn't even see that. It just sees the HTML structure, and that's what it can operate on. And the other thing I was thinking about while working on this is kind of multi-file diagnostics too. So if we can see the view files, we know you're doing a render call here, and we also see you're specifying a partial. And given the Rails conventions, this partial must be in the same folder. So we kind of look this up and see if this partial is actually there, or give you some advanced like errors diagnostics that something is wrong with this call. You can just see this as a static analysis time. And here this example is actually from the Stimulus use case, where you have the control on the top level, but the target is has to be inside of it. But if you kind of can trace this and kind of combine these two partials into one tree again, we can even give you some advanced diagnostic to say you are missing the controller or you're missing the attribute somewhere. So it's really kind of go super deep with that. There are some more other gems that could probably benefit from this parser now that we have it. So my idea is also to try to see where we can improve some of these gems with this new parser to make it easier for them to maintain them as well. So yeah, the conclusion here is that if you have been following the Prism tool, the Prism parser, it really had a big effect on the whole ecosystem for Ruby tooling, which is also what Ruby LSP uses massively and like heavily to actually build these tools. So that's been awesome. And I think that kind of this herb parser now can also have a similar effect for the whole view layer of tools to improve what we have in our tool and in our editor every day. And yeah, the community has really built awesome tools. Like also, if you think about Rubocop and all of the other tools that are using Prism now too, there are some awesome tools out there for Ruby specifically. But I also think that we can kind of now bring the same care to the view layer, especially now with Hotwire being so popular again, that this really makes life easier for everyday work. And yeah, I think with Herb we have a good foundation now to make this happen, and it's fun to work on. That's why I'm doing all of this, and that's why I also love Ruby, and that's why I want to keep using Ruby, and that's why I built these tools. Selfishly for myself, but if other people can kind of benefit from that too, that's the idea here. I want to make it as attractive as possible for people to use Ruby, and that's part of it. So it starts with the developer experience, and if that sucks already, people are inclined to leave, so we should improve that. But yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing. That's a summary here to kind of show we have new tools, a new parser that's HTML aware. We have some Node.js bindings and WebAssembly bindings for that, including the Ruby bindings. We get diagnostics, we get HTML errors and awareness, and all these other kind of things in here. I also want to say a big thanks to all these people here that have helped with this tool in some way or another to make it actually possible to build this. So that's a thanks to them. And also a big thanks to all these people that have been contributing to these libraries that I've been using to build Herb itself. You can check it out on herbtools.dev, that's the project. And if you kind of want to help with just seeing how good it works, or how well it works, I would love to see if you're using HTML ERB, to just install the gem and run this analyze command on your project. It will kind of scan through all HTML ERB files and give you a report of how much it could parse or where it will actually crash. So as more kind of crashes I can see from your actual code base that the parser doesn't handle, we can kind of improve. So if you have any kind of feedback or ideas or what we can do with this, please tell me after the thing. Yeah, one more thing. The other project I was working on is Ruby Events. It's this website for indexing all events and Ruby conferences. So you also have the Rails hook on here. You can check it out here too. It's just this thing where we have an iOS app to show all the Ruby events that are happening around the world, also in Switzerland. And gives you an overview of the events, of the talks, of the speakers, and it's available on iOS and soon coming to Android too. But that's all I have. So, thank you.